All right, so this is our last portion of the day. This is basically just an opportunity where we've tried to have a general progression over the course of the day of various topics, beginning with just some general philosophical ideas regarding the importance of health screening and the ability for practical clinicians to help their clients make more informed decisions, whether to breed their dogs at all, and if they're going to do so in an informed fashion, in an ethical fashion. Then we proceeded on and we had some discussion on DNA testing. We discussed the importance of proper positioning in radiographic films and elbows, hips and elbows. Dr. Brown talked to us about the importance of research and how the OFA gets involved in that. We had Dr. Bromberg address some ocular issues, and then finally Dr. Keller concluded the day with just an overall discussion of the total OFA package of databases that are involved. So again, this is sort of just an end-of-the-day conclusion. It's an opportunity for you to ask any questions that are on your mind about the OFA, how we function, how the OFA attempts to help fellow veterinarians reduce the incidence of genetic disease and make improvements in our dogs. So Dr. Barstow is out there in the room, and she will carry mics to you. So we are recording all this, so it's important that you try, if you ask questions, that you ask with the mic that Dr. Barstow is going to provide, so we can actually archive this session as well. I think Dr. Bell wants to lead off. He's got some things that he wants to show you. Is that correct?
Yeah. If you wanted to write your questions down and send them through the polling software, we have moderation, so we don't run one question on top of another while one's being answered. But if you type in your questions, if you weren't here on the first session this morning, if you go to a web page on your phone, polev.com/OFA-VMX, you will have a box. You can just type your question in that box and send it. Or if you want to text to the address 22333, and then once you would send, you would type in OFA VMX and send that, and then after that you can just type in a question and send it. If you already did the OFA VMX to 22333 this morning and you still have that text line there, then you don't have to repeat it. Just go ahead and send it again and send a question. So if you want to ask with the microphone or send it through the polling software, we'll be able to answer your questions. Thank you.
One of the things that really struck me in listening to all the different lectures is there's so much great material out there, and I wonder what kind of initiative could be taken collaboratively by a lot of you to get the word out there to veterinarians and the general public about the resources that are available through OFA and Canine Health Foundation, because it's only as good as how many people in the public know about it and how many practicing veterinarians around the country know about it. How can we help to get that word out?
I'll start, and I'll just say while it's no excuse, just the understanding of the OFA is, there's I think especially among breeders, there's a lot of people that envision that the OFA is this mammoth organization and this giant ivory tower someplace making these judgment calls and so forth, when in reality it's a very small nonprofit in a little building with about 12 employees sitting in the middle of Missouri. So the message there is that our resources are extremely limited, both in terms of staff and in terms of financials. However, again, that's no excuse. So in terms of helping to get the message out, we attempt to, when we can, come to functions such as this. We have acknowledged that the world is changing and that social media is a huge opportunity for disseminating information. So we've tried to embrace that. So we've done, within the last 2 years, a complete revamp of that website to make it hopefully more user-friendly and more powerful. We've tried to embrace social media in terms of Facebook and so forth. We make ourselves available for, kennel club presentations, national kennel clubs, or national parent club presentations. As you know, Anne-Marie, we've tried to embrace educational programs at the vet schools to try and do sort of a grassroots effort so that vet students as they're graduating or coming out, already having some basic familiar with the OFA. So we're attempting to do that. However, anything that people can do to help is more than welcome. Any suggestions are more than welcome. And any of the panel members have anything to add?
I would just say that we need your help too. There have been situations in which the OFA has contacted different veterinary schools, and I have personally talked to deans when we have offered to do an educational event, or in some cases even offer some financial support, and a dean of a vet school has said to me, OFA, I've never heard of the OFA. I think that's pretty tragic. So go back to everybody you know and tell us. I feel great about this organization. I don't think you can find any group of individuals who is more purely committed to just dog wellness than the people that are involved with the OFA. So help us spread the word.
I think that's exactly the point, is that you have so much great information, but a limited resource to disseminate it. And there are so many parent clubs out there that could be putting all this stuff on their website, on their Facebook pages. The AKC itself has a publicity department. Even with Westminster coming up, I mean, I'm doing a social media thing where I talk about it's more than just the dogs, it's One Health. It's way more than just a dog show. So I think if we start throwing ideas out there and we get more people to participate in it, that could make a difference.
So, can you hear me? At AKC Canine Health Foundation, we do a lot of messaging. We've got a veterinary outreach platform that goes to clinics. We send quarterly newsletters. We send mailings. If you follow us on our Facebook page, you will get health updates on a regular basis that we put out through Facebook. We have a quarterly newsletter separately that goes to health and genetics representatives of every AKC breed club. This is all through AKC Canine Health Foundation resources and channels. Then in addition to that, we've partnered now with the AKC and their veterinary outreach. They have a VetNet specific website, and they have a much bigger veterinary practice reach. And then with that VetNet group, we're getting out quarterly newsletters with them. And we are also now going to all of the U.S. veterinary schools for lunch and learns, where we talk to the veterinary students. I have implemented something I call the University Project, where we're going to those deans of the vet schools with a listing of the amount of dollars and lists of grants they have gotten over the years from Canine Health Foundation, and run into the same thing. They don't know who we are, and they didn't know that they had $500,000 of research money from us right now. But this is, you know, getting in the door. The other thing is that we're now getting invitations to those places that we didn't get before. And like Eddie said, we tag team on these things, but these invitations to conferences help with that outreach as well to the veterinary schools. So I would say we're really trying to target practicing veterinarians, breeders and breed clubs, parent clubs, general public, veterinary students, and then through the social media channels. And we do this all with a very small staff too, but like Fran said, what we have found is if somebody's following our Facebook and they'll share our posts on theirs, that's when we really get evidence that the information's out there. But I think, Anne-Marie, these are probably new things that we've started within the last year and a half since I've been there. And I think the power for us of partnering with AKC is that they get to millions of people, you know, we get to thousands. So that expands the reach. And then we share what OFA does as well. You know,
I think what Fran and I touched on at the first session, and Diane has mentioned as well, is that there's really four populations. You've got the veterinarians, and we're trying to educate veterinarians. There are the breeders, and the bottom line is it's the breeder that has to do the health testing on their breeding stock before they breed. That's where it all ends up. But and getting that message out. But then there are the breed organizations, the parent health clubs, and they are getting online, are doing a very good job as well. But it's the public which is the hardest one to get the word across, because the public is the one driving the engine. If someone can go online and click on a dog and pay through PayPal and get shipped a puppy without any question, sight unseen, then there's no impetus for breeders to do the right thing. And so really educating the public as to what the expectations of a breeder and of a health-conscious breeder is important. And when we try to get that message out to the public and to the media, unfortunately, the media, they want ratings, and the ratings go up when they talk about sick inbred dogs and horrible breeders. And the ratings don't go up when they say, you know what, the public has a responsibility when they purchase a puppy as to how they purchase a puppy. Ratings don't go up with that message. And so it's very difficult getting that message out into the media and the public sphere, and all we can do is keep on trying. Okay, we have a question that was sent in. As you scan the horizon of scientific discovery, how do you see OFA's role changing as the genetic basis for many of these diseases are being discovered?
I don't see our role changing hugely. What I see as tests are developed and we're convinced of their validity, as we mentioned previously in several of these sessions, if there is a request from a parent club, or if the veterinary specialist approach us with a desire to maintain an additional database, we will add them. We don't currently have a mechanism in place, nor do I think we want to or need to, that if you have a panel that tests for 150 different genes, that you want that client to necessarily have us list or gather data on all of those individual genes, when in many cases we have not proven that the gene is associated with any type of debilitation in a particular breed of dog. So I think it will expand much the way it is until our technology really, really improves to the extent that we know exactly what we're testing for.
I would add, as the frontline person that works in the office that fields many of these questions, whether they come from breeders or dog owners who are receiving tests, or veterinarians and so forth, and Anita, maybe you can jump in. But I think probably where it's really going to change for us is as the landscape of the DNA tests change. Mm-hmm. So the low-hanging fruit has been discovered. So the single gene, single autosomal recessives, that are causing a lot of grief. The research community has to date focused on those, and so they've made many of those discoveries, whether it's PRCD, PRA, or von Willebrand's, many of those diseases. So the focus now is on more complex polygenic diseases, and we're starting to see tests. Dr. Oberbauer referenced that test that we see in Shelties right now for the dermatomyositis, which involves 3 different genes, and we're establishing risk probability, right? Now, the average Sheltie owner, when they get that report, it's going to list these different genotypes that the labs are reporting out, and it truly does. Initially, on first glance, it looks like complete hieroglyphics to the dog owner, to us in the office, and it would to you as the veterinarian. So unless you know how to take that, and there are, I think that there are over 100 combinations of genotypes that this particular test can yield. So unless you know how to decipher that and then counsel the owner how to interpret that information, that's all very difficult. So we've gone from a previous world where we had clear carrier and affected. It was very nice and clear cut. These were sort of the gold standard DNA tests. Applied correctly, in theory, you could eliminate that disease from that population, right? If applied, and you weren't concerned about any other traits, you were only concerned about that single trait, and you applied, it was a single autosomal recessive, and you applied the basic Mendelian inheritance patterns. You could literally eliminate the disease. The difficulty again is now we are way past clear carrier affected results, and we're starting to talk about at risk instead of affected, probability, low risk, high risk, and that's where, at least from a counseling perspective and with the advances being made in genotypic tests, I think that's where we're seeing the biggest changes.
So I would like to add, based on that, and I'll just use DM as an example. DM is a risk assessment test, but I recently had a Chesapeake breeder call me who realized that he had bred a bitch who, according to her genotype, was at risk to a male that he thought had been tested for DM and in fact had not, and when tested, also had 2 copies of what really increased his risk. And the question of that breeder was to me, I now have 10 2-week-old puppies. Do you think I should euthanize them? Because they're all going to be crippled. And that's where I think it's so important that our clients get the right kind of counseling and that people really understand the tests.
There was recently a gene test released for border collies for goniodygenesis, which is abnormal development of the angle, which potentially could lead to the development of glaucoma. There was a colony of basset hounds at the university at the Ohio State that all had goniodygenesis, and they were followed by an ophthalmologist for 20 years, and not one developed glaucoma. Although, you know, if I know I have an appointment coming in and it's a basset hound, it's like glaucoma walking. So the question is that I had from the president of the Border Collie Club is, because one of the members was involved in this development, was that people were getting on the bandwagon of having their dogs tested, and unfortunately with this particular test, a very large percentage of the dogs being tested were coming out positive, and people were panicking because they thought, oh my God, my dog's going to develop glaucoma. Well, there's a difference between the test result and what the test represents, and whether the test is even a test that's necessary or applicable to the situation. So it's important for us to be able to interpret these things. I routinely am asked all the time to include during my eye clinics for inherited diseases to do gonioscopy, which is looking at the angle. And I always ask people, well, what are you going to do with the information? And they can never answer me. If your dog has an abnormal angle, are you going to say you're only going to breed dogs with absolutely normal open angles? What are you going to do with the information? And that's the problem with people sort of almost having information, but not really enough to know what to do with the information.
There was a question up here in the front.
First off, a comment on how are you going to get the word out about all the testing we can do. Almost every veterinarian I know has a really good social networking set up with his own website or his Facebook or whatever. If we were to have a nice statement coming from OFA/CHIC on here's the things we would recommend you look for, and go to our website at such and such, and then we could preemptively during pet giving seasons like Christmas, Easter, times of the year, we could at least 2 or 3 times a year send out a promotion for that effect. So anyway, that's the one thing I would think of. I guess getting back down to micro managing here, I would like to know, since every PinHip and every one of the European registries that I deal with require sedation or anesthetic for their hip and elbow x-rays. Why does OFA not require that?
Who wants to answer that?
I'm tired of wrestling big dogs.
Do you want me to?
Go ahead.
I'll answer that question. On the advice of counsel, we have been told that if we require sedation and there were an event related to sedation / whatever a veterinarian would elect to use, that could potentially make OFA liable for the adverse event. So on the recommendation of counsel, we recommend it, but we don't require it, and that legal counsel had that suggestion.
And we've also analyzed the difference between those have been chemically restrained and only physically restrained, and gone through now 3 years worth of data. And what we find is that the difference is about a half a grade. So, you know, if people are not going to radiograph and screen because you're requiring sedation, you know, we always say that it's important to use chemical restraint, and that's what our recommendation is, but you can use physical restraint. And if people don't want to use chemical restraint, don't want to pay for it, or for whatever reason, and they don't screen, well, then we've lost that population of dogs that probably should be bred as well, for a half-grade difference between physical and chemical. And that's what we're coming up with, so we're doing the best that we can. I just want to mention, because we talked about degenerative myelopathy, just to understand a little bit, because there is a lot of controversy about that. 19 breeds have clinically diagnosed degenerative myelopathy, and at this point in time, no other breeds are susceptible to degenerative myelopathy unless we have a histopathological confirmation from individuals in that breed. The breeds that have degenerative myelopathy, the frequency of that disease is at most 2% in the most severely affected breeds, the Boxer and the German Shepherd, Rhodesian Ridgeback, you know, Chessie, you know, with lower percentages there. But look at what the testing percentages are for the at-risk Australian. Okay, let's go to some of the breeds that we know have the disease, actually. 48.7% of Boxers are homozygous at risk for that mutation. If you look at the German Shepherd dogs, 14.3%, not as bad. But you've got very high numbers, so this disease was never meant to diagnose what dogs are going to come down with that disease. All we know is that every dog that has histopathologically confirmed degenerative myelopathy are homozygous at risk for that DM mutation, that SOD1 mutation. And at this point in time, the other mutations that are required to cause that disease process have not been identified and are likely present in the breeds that have the disease and not present in breeds that never have and never will have that disease. And this is why a DM test result in any other breed should be completely ignored. It doesn't matter whether it's at risk or normal, because it won't cause disease in that breed. And so this is the first of that type of at-risk test, and there's going to be plenty more coming down the pike. So it's important for us to understand these types of things.
Is it possible to find out how many confirmed cases of DM there are? I mean, is Joan Coates keeping that data?
Is it possible to know exactly?
So the question is, epidemiologically, do we have accurate data in terms of the incidence of the disease? And as Dr. Smith alluded to this morning, she wasn't talking about DM specifically, but just canine disease in general, because there are no central reporting mechanisms, no. So does Dr. Coates, who's probably the primary researcher in terms of DM at the University of Missouri, the neurologist there, does she have statistics regarding her caseload and dogs that are presenting to her and so forth? Of course she does. But can we universally go across the country and say, here's the true incidence of DM and German Shepherds? We know that last year X number were diagnosed. Unfortunately, there is no reporting mechanism for anything like that.
At all.
And for any canine disease, really. The closest thing you may have, we did not look at, and we just ran out of time, but like if you look at the Blue Book statistics, Dr. Bromberg referenced the Blue Book for ocular conditions. That's probably one of the few tools that's out there that's truly gathering really valid reportable incidents of disease. So every ophthalmologist, when they're doing one of these exams, if they're diagnosing glaucoma or keratitis or whatever the particular ocular case may be, they're diagnosing that, they're feeding that data into the database, we're recording it by breed, we're recording the size of the cataract, the location of the cataract, and so forth. So probably ocular conditions are probably one of the few examples where we truly have a really solid collection tool. But unfortunately, going back to your question, for something like DM, there is no reporting mechanism.
Right.
There was one study done by a researcher at UC Davis back in the, I think, 1990s or so, and using the Veterinary Medical Database Program, which really provided data only from veterinary schools. But since degenerative myelopathy is a significant disease and a lot of these dogs ended up at vet schools, it was a pretty good sample, and that's where the percentages of 2% and 1 point whatever and so forth come from in terms of that. But that's the best study that we have that shows the low incidence. Unfortunately, when you have a private practice, if you have a breeder whose dogs have all the genes, you might say, gee, all of the boxers come down with degenerative myelopathy. But you also might, have other practices in other areas that don't see any degenerative myelopathy because it really has to do with the local breeders and what they are breeding. So it's hard to call it. But I think most of us understand that when we see DM, it's a rare disease, especially in these very populous breeds.
I'm sorry, Eddie, I have to correct you because most of the statistics come from breeding dogs that are being brought in, and it's very few people that report clinical cases. So, obviously, as like Basset Hounds are brought in, well, I hardly ever see one for an OFA clearance, but if a Basset Hound was brought in for a clearance, it might get clear and have glaucoma the very next day, but then it's not going to be reported as having glaucoma. So there are problems between the disconnect between some of these genetic tests and some of the survey, eye exams that are being done versus clinical practice. Sorry.
So I just wanted to follow up on that very fact, because what I was emphasizing in my talk is the need for all dogs to be tested. And having those dogs tested would then go into this database with respect at least to the eyes, so that there would be a much better estimate of prevalence and incidence. But the big question, or the big hurdle that we have in the United States, is no central collection of disease documentation and recording. Smaller countries in Europe, they do insurance. So most of the dogs have pet insurance, and every time there's a claim against that insurance, they can get the actual document for a condition. We don't have that. Be nice.
Just real quick to add to what Anita said, a lot of times if you see a peer-reviewed publication and it references incidents, a lot of times they're referencing Swedish data. And as Anita alluded to, one of the reasons is that it's just a whole different culture. Right. And this stuff is reported, and almost all dogs, there's very few mixed breed dogs in Sweden. The vast majority of dogs are purebred. The vast majority of dogs are insured through pet insurance. So companies like Agria in Sweden, which is the primary insurance provider for pet insurance over there, they obviously have huge data sets for their underwriters. Right? And so a lot of times when we see those kind of incidence rates, they're actually referencing European populations because they do have valuable and solid data on incidence.
So to go along with what we've been talking about, we talked a little bit about those surveys that OFA has on their website by the breed. So we can look up the incidence for those certain diseases that are owner-driven, at least. Do we collate those to put all of the breeds together for all of the different diseases?
No, so again, you really have to take that kind of survey data with a really large grain of salt. So that's purely owner-reported data, and it's primarily used by those parent clubs that ask us to host the survey to monitor the overall state of health of their breeds. So is there an emerging disease that breeders were unaware of that perhaps is being all of a sudden reported with greater frequency? Or is there a perception of a disease that was out there that was associated with that particular breed? And when you look at the owner-reported statistics, the incidence is virtually zero. So where did that come from? Maybe we were totally off base thinking that this particular disease was of concern for this breed. So it's the data in that particular case is used by parent clubs to monitor the overall health of their breed. And then the other thing where it becomes really important and valuable is in the research area, in particular, very limited financial resources, okay? So as a member of the National Beagle Club, and we've got the Gordon Setter Club member and the Labrador Club member and so forth, our parent clubs were all very active in donating money back to research efforts. And when you've got organizations that we can funnel the dollars through, like the AKC Canine Health Foundation, we need to make sure that those dollars are well spent, all right? So we want to make sure, in my particular breed, Beagles, we talked about epilepsy numerous times throughout the day. That is one of the diseases that we truly do see incidents of in our breed, that we're concerned about. And when we're trying to prioritize a very limited set of resources, financial and otherwise, towards research geared towards improving the health of our particular breed, we want to know what are the true concerns of the breeders out there. So it's used to monitor the overall health of the breed, to help focus limited resources towards research that's important for the breed. It is certainly not meant to provide a statistically valid incidence rate of various diseases in a particular breed. So that's sort of that's the purpose of those surveys.
With this amazing amalgamation of veterinary practices now in corporate settings, are you in any position to influence asking the Mars Corporation to produce some of this information from their clinical cases?
Banfield, which is one of the biggest providers of corporate medicine, keeps their own data on incidents, and they report it every year. Believe me, it is reported in a way that is usable, and typically ear infections and skin disease come up at the top of the list. The last time I looked at the list, there was nothing on there that had anything to do with genetic disease of any type. That data is very proprietary, and unless everyone in this room wins big lotteries, there is zero chance that Mars is going to give us that data.
I will say, though, that there are times that Mars has looked to specialists to look at that data and to come up with some conclusions.
Right.
And so I did have to sign away my firstborn child, but since I don't have a firstborn child, I didn't really care about it.
Right.
In order to work with that data. And what I reported back to them was their data is good for healthy animals as to the little things that occur with them. But unfortunately, since Banfields are mostly in the PetSmarts and don't do emergency and don't do major surgery or major medical workups, none of the serious genetic diseases that we see in dogs were in their data.
Right.
So it's not the best data to be looking at. In England, you have the Vet Compass program that was set up by Dan O'Neill, and one reason that works is that the majority of small animal practices in Great Britain use a single veterinary medical records program, so that they were able to compile the data on that in terms of diagnoses. And so there have been a lot of articles on that, on the Vet Compass data, but you also have to recognize that every population and every study has some bias to it. Absolutely. And if you don't recognize those biases, you will be led astray.
I would like to add to that about the biases. I think when we hear about diseases in purebred dogs, biases are triggered by local populations, but also by the facility that reports them. So from the pet owner standpoint, you have a veterinary practitioner, a clinician that sees usually their healthy dogs, vaccinate them, Then you have specialists where the dog has a particular need in some area that they're referred to. And ultimately, you have emergency and referral hospitals. Those are tertiary facilities. The population at a University of Minnesota, which is where I went to school, compared to a population in general practice is hugely diverse. And I'll give you an example from the Labrador Retriever. First of all, Labrador Retrievers have been the most popular breed in the United States for over 20 years, and their registration pretty much totals all other registered dogs in any 1 year. If you were to ask the University of Minnesota what the incidence of laryngeal paralysis in the elderly Labrador Retriever is, they would tell you that it is the most common breed that they see with it, and that the incidence is high. Well, of course it's going to be the most common breed. It's the most popular dog in the country for 20 years. You don't have to be a math genius to figure that out. If you were to ask practitioners how high the incidence of laryngeal paralysis is in Labrador Retrievers, and the Midwest has huge numbers. I'm a Labrador breeder, and I'm known for seeing Labradors. We see thousands in our practice. I perhaps see one elderly Labrador Retriever a year that has laryngeal paralysis. For that dog, it's devastating. But does that mean the breed has an overwhelming problem with laryngeal paralysis? No, it's your statistical bias based on your population.
One of the other databases that we've been able to access for research studies is in the realm of infectious disease. So IDEXX has been very generous in sharing regional data and test results when we're researching some of these emerging infectious diseases that I mentioned. So that has been a very collaborative relationship.
I had another question about the challenge of genetic testing, and it's happening to my breed for the first time this year. We sponsored, as all of you know, the research that Gus Aguirre did at U of Penn for the gene for RCD1. And that has always been done by Optogen for us. Optogen was acquired by Mars Optimal Health. And this year, if we want to offer that test at our health clinic, we must run the full genetic panel on every Irish setter we send in the blood for. And I did talk to Jerry a little bit about this last year. We don't have a choice. We know that Optogen's the place we want to run our samples. We know their integrity is excellent, and that's where the samples will be run. But Irish setters will get this panel of tests that Mars Optimal Health does, which will blow our people out of the water. Absolutely. And I know that's going to happen. And I've gotten some good files from Optimal Health to kind of explain the whole thing, but it's opening up another entire can of worms. We can't be the first and only parent club this is happening to. But how do you deal with that? We don't have any choice. Optogen will still run our CLAD and RCD4 samples. We also accept the OFA RCD4 samples as valid. But it's backing us into a corner where we don't want to go, and we don't have any choice. Any insight about that? Do you see the future?
Yeah, corporations. I don't know if any of you noticed that, Hills all of a sudden instituted shipping charges once again on us to buy food. And so, I've been telling my clients, because I use mostly the Purina prescription products, and so the clients I've had in Hills, they just told me to go to Chewy.com, and why would Hills do that? And then 2 months later, I get an email that says, Hills is now going to send your prescription diets directly to your clients and market to them and send them marketing information, and this is the new Hills corporations. So does Paw Prints run the test on Irish setters? Because they will run individual tests. And they're much more flexible in terms of what they will run for an individual or for a breed club if you contact them.
our challenge is we really want to go with somebody who is running Gus's technology, because unfortunately when there were lots of fly-by-nights, and you all remember that period where there would be other companies running it, we had 2 people's breeding programs devastated by the fact that their dogs were cleared for RCD1 and turned out to carry it and produce blind dogs because the tests were invalid. So it's very hard to switch midstream when you've got a group of breeders convinced that Optogen is the only way to go, and that's where you want your test run. I don't know.
And unfortunately, Optogen got bought out, and that's what happens. A corporation buys you out. Some corporations will buy out a company and then put them on the shelf because they just wanted to eliminate the competition. You know, so it's what corporations do. Unfortunately, and maybe fortunately, I think panel testing is where everything's going. So that you know, and it's going in people as well as it is in dogs and other species. Genomic medicine is the new frontier, and you know, every baby will get their heels, you know, pricked with a blood sample, and you will know whether they're going to be prone to heart disease or asthma or diabetes in the future, and we can do all sorts of modifications to prevent the expression of those diseases, and we're going to have the same thing in our dogs as well. And maybe even part of when we register our dogs with the AKC, it's all going to get run on the same sample just to make it easy for everyone as well. So that's what the future holds, but unfortunately we're in the Wild West right now where there are no rules, and these are the little places we find ourselves between a rock and a hard place, and hopefully it will improve.
So have you contacted Optogen at all but I mean, have you asked them because I know that they're doing these panels theoretically to save breeders money.
Their hands are tied. They absolutely cannot run RCD4 for us through Optogen. I managed to get that done last year because they were in transition. By contract, they cannot.
Can you ask them to only report that? I mean,
well, honestly, it's not the charge. Optimal Health are smart people. They didn't really upcharge us too much for all these results, but our members are going to get all the results because that's how they report them. Are we going to pay for OFA to record them? No, we're only going to pay OFA to record the RCD1 results. That's how we're going to get around it, but the people are still going to get all those results.
And so that, as Jerry mentioned, is where we're going. There's going to be a plethora of information that tidal waves over people. And so as a professor, I have to say the next step is education. And we have to spend information, or we have to spend effort to get education out there. And it's going to be a challenge because we have Dr. Google, and we have personal opinion. I have a student just came to me and said her mother heard on the web that Chihuahuas are actually from foxes, so she was very excited that Chihuahuas were from foxes. And I said no, and I pulled up all the data, but Dr. Google told her that. So there's this challenge that we have, but I'm sorry, I don't recall your name, but you were saying that the AVMA has this policy where it's education and outreach. And so we need to come up, collective we, public, veterinarians, researchers, to develop talking points and clear information that can be shared across all of these venues and across the different populations of the consumer, the public, and the media, and try and illustrate what this means. Because your mixed breed dog owner is going to get the exact same information. They're not going to know what to do with it either. So it's going to take time, and it's going to need to be done incrementally, but it's a path we have to take. And I don't have the solution, but I know that that's the direction we have to go. And the corporations, we work with the corporations as well, and they do want to be
helpful as well as profitable. And so with that, with that in mind, we will continue to work with Mars and with Embark and Paw Prints and Oravet and all the others that are doing these panel testing to see that it actually is a useful product that is helpful and not just adding confusion to the whole situation.
I work for VCA, therefore I work for Mars. So, I mean, I feel for you. But as a benefit of working for Mars, I can get personalized M&Ms.
Any other questions? Dr. Barstow is back there.
My question was about the autoimmune thyroiditis, and from reading through the notes that I took here, I know that certain things with malnutrition and starvation can affect that. I know that there's also a lot of breeders that are now very into feeding raw, and could things like ground trachea that probably still has a beef thyroid on it affect that autoimmune thyroiditis, to your knowledge? And whether it does or not, would you recommend not breeding those dogs that come back as having the autoimmune thyroiditis?
I'm sorry. At my age with my hearing, I could not hear what you were saying.
Can you hear me now? Okay. So the question was about the autoimmune thyroiditis. And I don't know whether or not a breeder feeding the raw ground trachea that could have beef thyroid on it could affect it?
Come up here where I can hear you.
She's asking about this. The dog food has like tracheas with thyroid in it.
No, raw. They're feeding raw.
So they're feeding raw, and they're getting thyroid tissue in their diets, and it's just going to throw out thyroid testing.
Shouldn't.
So
Can beef trachea or beef thyroid throw off that autoimmune thyroiditis?
I can't answer that directly. I really don't know. My gut feeling is that it would be no, because it's going through into the dog as food. It's going to be digested, the basic ingredients assimilated, and that dog's going to have to, produce it. I don't think, unless somebody else knows something I don't know, I don't think that would affect it.
Okay. So if the dog comes back as having the autoimmune thyroiditis, would you recommend not breeding those dogs?
In the scenario where that's being fed raw food like that and testing positive.
She's testing positive, so.
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend it. And maybe if it was low positive, to retest the dog later on. But if it's a really high positive, number for that autoantibody, I wouldn't breed it.
Right, and I would agree. That's what I would say as a theriogenologist. Find a different bitch.
So I don't know if I'm going to be controversial, and I'm not disputing any of that. But we also always preach the message that
Don't throw the baby out with
exactly,
the bathwater.
and so that we're not making any breeding decisions based upon a hip, an eye, a heart, a thyroid gland, etc. So it's the holistic approach to dog breeding, and we always need to consider severity of disease,
Right.
quality of life, the incidence of the disease, the mode of inheritance of the disease. So it's this complete picture. And I think Dr. Keller referenced in his hip talk that it may be, if you're breeding bulldogs and hips are one of the criteria you're looking at, that you may have a difficult time finding a bulldog with good hips or excellent hips. And it may be that you need to include an occasional mildly dysplastic bulldog in your breeding pool. It may be, if you're breeding English setters, that you're going to have to include the occasional dog that's hypothyroid in the breeding pool. So it's this complete picture. Quality of life, severity of disease, incidence, incidence of that disease in that breed. It may be so hyperuricosuriae in Dalmatians 10 years ago. If you're going to eliminate every Dalmatian that had it, Dalmatians would be extinct today, right? Because it was a fixed trait. So it's that holistic, complete picture. So that's why your role as a veterinarian becomes very important to help counsel that owner to make hopefully an informed decision.
And yes, I'll back off on that. I would say if she had to choose, you would choose the one that is normal. But it is still a whole animal. And in some breeds that would be very, very, very difficult. To me, it would be like, people ask me, because I breed Labradors and I'm the health chair for the Labrador Club, what do you think about using an OFA fair Labrador in a breeding program? Well, the reality is when we have hundreds of thousands of them, there's really no necessity to use a fair.
Why settle for mediocrity in
right,
that case?
and in that case. On the other hand, if you have an Affin pincher where they have less than 100 puppies a year, absolutely, a fair, you know, hey, that's fabulous.
And at least for in ophthalmology, you would not find an ophthalmologist that would tell you to never breed a carrier.
Right.
Because if you only breed normals, I mean, because most of these genetic tests, like for PRA, were not meant to get rid of PRA, but to get rid of dogs that are going to go blind. So carriers bred to normals is fine. You want to avoid carrier to carrier, but if you breed only normals, then you're going to bring out traits that are probably 10 times worse than what you're trying to avoid.
All right, so our red light's going off. We've hit the 4:45 mark. We'd like to thank you all for joining us today. Dr. Smith made a statement earlier somewhere during the course of the day that I don't think you'll find a group of people that are truly believe in what we think is a very noble mission of the OFA. So that said, while we've hit the 4:45 mark, if any of you guys want to stay or ask a more personal question of anybody that's up here one-on-one, please feel free because we'd be happy to address those. Other than that, thank you and enjoy the rest of the conference.